Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for a video about what it's like working as a minority in Japan and Korea. My name is Asim Hussein. I'm an Indian Canadian from Toronto. I'm joined by my friend Asim Su. He's a Chinese American from San Diego. So starting with Su, I just want to hear your experiences when you moved to Japan for the second time as an adult to work at a major company there. How was it? How tough was it for you to fit in locally? You're Chinese and you're American, there's nothing Japanese about you, but you can speak Japanese. So how was that experience in the beginning?
Well, so the second time when I came back to Japan, I was 21 years old, straight out of college, and I was joining a Japanese company as my first full-time job ever in my life. So it was not so much that I was Chinese American that really bothered me, but it's just that I never had any proper work experience before joining this Japanese company. And now I'm trying to learn about how to be a proper white collar worker and being a Japanese salaryman all at the same time. So it was trying to learn a lot of things at the same time and had a lot of difficulties trying to learn all of this at the same
Well, what are the
time.
difficulties that really come to mind? Is there any situation that occurred that you thought, oh man, I really screwed this up, or I should have done this
Yeah.
differently?
Well, I wouldn't say a specific episode, but one aspect of the Japanese culture or just work culture in general is just how do you deal with corporate hierarchy, or especially when you're a new guy straight out of college, how do you deal with people who are above you? Everybody's above you when you're first joined the company. So, say for example, when somebody who is above you invites you to lunch or dinner, and of course you don't want to go, you probably have your own thing to do, but it's very hard for you to say no. I
Hmm.
probably made the mistake of saying no once in a while, and that probably doesn't reflect too good on my image within the
You're
company.
not getting
Yeah,
promoted
yeah,
anymore.
exactly. Yeah, even though the person would specifically say that, okay, this is just private lunch or dinner, and has nothing to do with work. It doesn't change anything about my impression of you within the company. But even though the person says that, probably there is some impact, some negative impact that
Hmm.
I overlooked. Yeah, so that was a big issue. Yeah. Well, I mean, what about you,
Hmm.
Sim? You worked in Japan, Korea as well.
No, it's I think my situation was quite different from yours, simply because of my appearance. Obviously, I'm not even Asian, so people just look at me, they see a foreigner. And to make matters worse than it was for you, I didn't actually speak business Japanese when I came to the country. I spoke conversational Japanese. It was pretty good. It was certainly good for a foreigner, but it wasn't the level you'd expect in order to integrate properly and work efficiently in a Japanese corporation, or even a foreign corporation with a branch in Japan. So I had to struggle with the language at the same time that I had to struggle with the culture. It's interesting you bring up that case of your coworker who invited you, and you were too straight up with him and just rejected his invitation. Actually, the similar thing happened to me. I was invited by a senior research professional in my company. I was a junior researcher, so I should have just said yes. So yeah, let's go have lunch together. Okay, fine. I know it's gonna be a boring lunch. I'm probably gonna struggle through the language, but it's a lunch, and I should do this for this with the sake of not just improving my Japanese, but in order to develop strong interpersonal relationships with my seniors. At the time, I was too self-centered, I think, or just thought, oh my God, it's going to be such a disaster of a lunch. Why don't I just, go read some sort of economic news that's more useful for my work in terms of actual applicability than going for lunch with this individual. I totally regret it now because I missed out on two different counts. The first count, I probably upset him by saying no, that I had other plans for that lunch. And the second count was that I missed the learning experience. If I had gone and I had struggled through that lunch, the next lunch with this individual or another senior Japanese individual would have been a lot easier. So I recommend to our viewers, if you have a lunch or dinner invitation from a senior person, you say yes, just go. And in Japan, a lot of these situations are honne tatemae. It's kind of the reality and the image. If people are letting you say no, you should doesn't mean you should say no because you have that option. You should consider what they're hoping for you to say, which is yes, they wouldn't have invited you in the first place if that was not their intention. So that's
Yeah,
that's
but
that's the kind of the
yeah,
difficulties that
okay.
I
But I mean,
face.
I guess for a lot of viewers, they probably think that it is also important to spend your own private time the way you want to spend it, right? I mean, as you
Mm,
mentioned, that you probably want to have lunch and read about news. That's probably pretty productive for you to learn about
mm,
things that are relevant to your own job. And of course, you probably don't want to go to lunch with another person you probably don't like. That's a
mm.
possibility as well. But as you mentioned, and as I experienced as well, building up relationship with your coworkers is very important. So how do you strike the balance between actually going for lunch or doing these team building activities versus you just trying
Mhm.
to do something that you prefer to do by yourself?
No, it's a good question. What's the level of sacrifice that you should be aiming for? I think that's the one way of putting it. I mean, it's not a major sacrifice, and we're not entering combat or anything, but you just have to look at it from the long term. And when you look at it from the long term perspective, you think, okay, if I decide to just subdue my own personal freedom or my own desires for this moment and spend the next 2 or 3 hours in the case of a dinner in Japan, or 1 hour, 1.5 hours in the case of a lunch, it's always going to pay off in the long run. I think that's the best way to look at it. So if you consider your short term and just think, okay, I spend the next hour doing what I want to do and actually enjoy my lunch by myself or with another foreigner friend of mine, or I can go with this senior Japanese individual who's probably not going to be that funny. Not always. I've had some senior Japanese who are funny, but in the majority of cases, they're probably not going to be that funny. So you go for this lunch, you have to sit through this lunch. You shouldn't look at it like that. You should look at, okay, I'm going to go through to this lunch. I'm going to have a cultural experience. It's like going to a Japanese restaurant, in which case you probably will go to a Japanese restaurant with a senior Japanese professional. And then you'll see how business is conducted in kind of like a training course. It's if you're doing this with a client, the stress level is very high. You're nervous. You're doing it with a senior from your own company. It's a lot lower level of stress. So it's kind of just a dress rehearsal for the real thing, so to speak. They're seniors, so you just have to be a little bit,
Yeah,
be careful of your behavior. So it's
right, right.
definitely worth it in the long run. And I think let's just segue to Korea because Japan, you said hierarchy. We've been discussing hierarchy so far. How was your experience working in Korea? Did you feel that hierarchy sense or having to subdue your own personal freedom for the greater good, so to speak? Or how was your experience
I,
there?
I have to say not really because I worked in Korea only as an English teacher, and working an English teaching company, it is a Korean company, but an English
Mm-hmm.
teaching company is very understandably very experienced with handling foreign employees, right? Because all the English teachers are of course foreigners.
Right, right.
So yeah, so even though it's a Korean company, they don't really behave like one, or at least the Korean bosses are very tolerant of English teachers doing whatever the hell they really want to do, right? So I can't say it's a very typical
Mm.
Korean company. So yeah, it's very hard for me to come to a conclusion based on my own experience. But I'm sure you do. I mean, you're working at a Korean company right now.
Yeah, so I work as a stock analyst in Seoul for our first-time viewers. In terms of how Korea works compared to Japan in terms of hierarchy, I think the difference is this. And again, I'm again a foreign face. I'm not East Asian. I can't even fit in on a racial level if I wanted to. And as a result, language-wise, again, I'm facing the same situation I face in Japan, but even worse. In my case, my Korean wasn't even conversational, and to now it's conversational now, but it's not even close to being business level. So in that respect, it's hard for me to communicate with my coworkers that easily. That said, a lot of coworkers, they do speak some English, so we manage to communicate to some extent. Certainly better than in Japan. In most cases in Japan, coworkers did not speak English. In Japan, the country's economy is so large that they don't need to necessarily look outside of their country in terms of finding work. Whereas Koreans, their economy is very small. They have to consider other countries, and English is the language of global commerce. So that's just a language explanation there. In terms of the people themselves, for lunch, you pretty much have to go with your coworkers. It's not really a yes or no kind of choice, which is completely different in Japan. In Japan, I gave you the example of the senior researcher. In Korea, it's not so much the senior researchers. You just have to find some lunch partner to go and have lunch with. Otherwise, you'll be considered socially awkward because people in this culture are a lot more collectivistic than even in Japan. So in Japan, people go have lunch all the time by themselves. But in Korea, everybody goes out at the same time, roughly, in the part of the city that I work in. And it's often the same for many other companies. Everybody walks out all around 11:30, 11:20, and then everybody goes to the restaurants around this time. The whole business district of restaurants are all packed. And you have to book these appointments for lunch, regardless of whether it's a senior or junior or same level as you, well in advance. People have 3, 4 weeks worth of lunch bookings. In terms of dinner, similar kind of story. If you want to go out on a Friday night, you can't generally message somebody and say, hey, let's go out on even a Thursday. You have to ask them the Monday of or even the week before, ideally, in order to figure out for private plans. For company 회식 or kaishoku in Japanese, these are company dinners. They typically don't happen that often as they used to, just because budgets are getting smaller here, people controlling costs. And they want to give junior employees that option to say no in both cultures. So these events, you have to pretty much, if they happen, you have to have a really good reason for not going, because they happen so rarely now that it would be almost disrespectful for you to not go without a valid reason. A valid reason would be, I'm not going to be in the country, or I have to visit a hospital, or something of similar that nature. It has to be serious enough that, okay, this is a real obstacle to not going. So that's how, in terms of socializing in the workplace as a minority, works in both countries.
Well, I have to say it's very, very different in Korea with all of this lunch bookings, and you have to go out for lunch with other people. But as you mentioned, I mean, it's of course it's not nice to be seen as socially awkward, but in terms of your career in Korea, what is the consequences? What are the negative consequences of, say, being seen as socially awkward and not, say, go out with lunch, go out for lunch with your coworkers on a regular basis?
I don't think there's no direct one-to-one sort of situation. So for example, let's say I decide not to go for lunch with any of my coworkers ever, and I just have lunch by myself every single day. There's a few people who actually do this, not every single day, but pretty often. I don't think the senior management holds that against them. It's not like it's a one-for-one situation. But what it does do is that it probably limits your prospects in terms of networking and staying atop kind of just company corporate politics. These corporate politics in any company, whether it's a Korean one, an American one, a Japanese one, Canadian one, it's quite important. This is just a global phenomenon. People are people, and people are still people when they work in a company, perhaps even more so because they're competing with other companies and with each other. So from that perspective, you're probably at a disadvantage. People will not see you as a fun person or as a team player from that perspective. But I don't think your bosses will hold it against you if you're performing properly. It's just, it will limit your opportunity to network within the company beyond just your own individual team or your own specific department. And it will probably limit you in that respect. And if you're a foreigner, which I am, and which Sue you are, if in Japan, and certainly if you came to Korea as well, you're not Korean. In our case, it's a language issue. It's a cultural issue. We don't get these experiences generally outside of work. I have Korean friends outside of work, but it's a completely different dynamic than at work. So if I have this opportunity to have lunch with somebody who doesn't speak English very well, particularly if they don't speak English very well, I'm forced to speak Korean or meet them halfway between English and Korean. So I definitely think foreigners should grab that opportunity with both hands.
Okay, sounds good. Well, I mean, I guess this is our time for this time. So any last comments for you?
No, I think this is a good wrap up. For people who are watching this, we hope you can come to Japan and Korea, work here, and enjoy your new lives in Japan and Korea. And we hope you join us for future videos. Thank you again for your time, and see you in the next video.